You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
This episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly is brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans, too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com. And welcome back to the latest episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show at DolphinsTalk.com, iTunes, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts. Be sure to check out the articles on DolphinsTalk.com. And for this week's episode, I feel a lot like Al Pacino's character, Coach Tony D'Amato, in the movie Any Given Sunday, before he's giving the speech to the Miami Sharks before their playoff game against the Dallas Knights. And I don't say that because the Dolphins aren't in the playoffs, but he starts off that speech with, "I don't know what to say, really." And that's sort of the feeling I have in regards to the Dolphins and this podcast. And let's get a couple of things straight. I'm not going to quit being a fan. I'll still be invested. I probably won't buy much merchandise, but I'll still watch every game that I can. I'll still probably travel to, Miami once a year. I saw the future list of opponents, so I'll probably get to 2 games next year. They do play in Indianapolis. And my love for the team won't change. That's the thing I've loved the most outside of family members since I was 6 years old, and started learning about them when I was in the 2nd grade and reading those books about the Super Bowls and learning about Don Shula and the no-name defense and the Killer Bees and Dan Marino. And I'm a Dolphins fan through and through. That won't change. I'll be a fan long after Mike McDaniel, Chris Grier, Tua Tagovailoa, and Tyreek Hill and all these guys are no longer part of the organization. I was a fan before, I'll be a fan after. So none of that's going to change, and my heart still belongs to the Dolphins. But the events that have transpired, and I won't even really talk about the loss to the Jets and the regular season finale. I know they lost 32-20. If you're like me and you live in the Midwest, about 25 miles west of Cincinnati, we got absolutely pummeled with snow. So that Sunday, my wife actually shoveled the driveway once before the game. I shoveled it once before the game and shoveled it again at halftime. I think I came back and it was 18-13 or whatever the weird score was. Miami had just scored the touchdown with Achane, and the game kind of got out of hand from there. Needless to say, combined, we shoveled the driveway 3 times on Sunday. By Monday morning, you couldn't tell. We got like 10 inches of snow, and as I record this on a Thursday night, we're supposed to get like 4 to 8 inches more tomorrow, and then even more on Saturday. So, you'll have to excuse the snuffles in my voice, but being outside, and I think we've had lows of 4 degrees last night and 1 degree tonight. So a little frigid here in the Midwest. And honestly, my mind, I tried to take it off of the Dolphins game. I didn't really pay much attention to that finale once you saw Denver go up 21-0 pretty early. And shout out to my good friend and coworker, Ray. Congrats on your Broncos ending their playoff drought. But it comes at the detriment to the Dolphins, and the Dolphins missed the playoffs again. And going into that game, I had, talked with several people who are more in the know than I am. There's usually 5 people I talk to. I was able to get a hold of 4 of them, and pretty much all 4 of them had the same vibe that at least McDaniel had bought in, his safety with some of those wins down the stretch and having them alive going into the regular season finale in Week 18, but that no matter what happened, barring some sort of miraculous jaunt to the Super Bowl, which never was going to happen, that Chris Grier was going to be out. And Stephen Ross, whether it's the absenteeism, the apathy, laziness, stupidity, his yearning for having a stable organization has made it so that the Dolphins are going to be stable by being consistently unstable. Chris Grier remains, and I think of all the media events and coverage of the Dolphins, and at least in terms of press conferences, not so much, like weird things like the Bullygate and having to watch Joe Philbin defend that. But in terms of pure press conference moments, I think the worst one for me is still Cam Cameron saying we need that thumb to go this direction after the selection of Ted Ginn back in the 2007 draft. But the whole bumbling, incoherent, just, contradicting themselves time and time again. The whole press conference of Grier and McDaniel was absolute horseshit. Nothing good came from that. You're airing out dirty laundry that should probably never, be heard by the fan base and by the public in general if you're good at what you do and you have a strong culture. But that got aired out like dirty laundry. And my first thought was, I go back to what, a friend of mine said when he was at the Combine the year that McDaniel first got hired before the Dolphins, before the draft in the 2022 season. And he had asked another head coach in the Shanahan tree, who I don't know who it was, but basically asked him, what are your thoughts on the Dolphins hiring Mike McDaniel? And the answer was, I can't believe Mikey got a team. And he goes, well, why is that? What makes you say that? And he goes, the response from the coach was, great football mind, but he's got a lot of work to do on the administrative things. And holy shit, that has come home to roost. And it's hit very hard in the last, 5 days, that the Dolphins, the culture, the lack of accountability from the top down really is just permeated into the roster. And, full transparency, I've been pretty good friends with Travis Wingfield for a long time. We've known each other since, had to be there late 2004 or very early 2005. And, I listen to his show as much as I can. And he made this point the other day. He does get a little bit of extra access to the field and stuff during practice that the normal media does not. And he mentioned it on his show. There's times when Tyreek Hill won't come out. Maybe that time could have been spent working on a jugs machine or things like that when they're doing special teams period to kick off practice. Sometimes Jaylen Ramsey does the same thing. It's 2 of your highest paid players, 2 of your team captains right there. That's a bad example to follow. It certainly seemed to rub several of the players the wrong way, most notably, Jonnu Smith, Jordan Brooks, Zach Sealer, 3 players who had really, really good seasons. I think Teron Armstead had a poignant comment when he said, it starts with Mike and Mike knows what he has to do. And to me, in hindsight, that's implying that Mike knows he's got a culture problem. I hope Stephen Ross knows that there's a culture problem. And maybe he'll take note of it. But I guess what I want to say is, while it's extremely disappointing to me, because I think on merit alone, both Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel should have been fired. It's extremely disappointing to me that they're still employed. And I think that's another conversation we need to have about Stephen Ross and being overly loyal and being a little bit too absentee to make these right calls, and maybe being old enough where he doesn't want to sit through another GM and head coach combined search effort. Well, I take that back because he's never done that. But instead of going full measure, he took no measure. And you're left with a team that's kind of rotting on the vine, so to speak, because you could tell just by the language and, Chris Grier especially calling out Tua Tagovailoa to take care of himself and not have those hits and, can't get injured. But then the very next breath saying, well, the offensive line wasn't good because, injuries happen, even though they signed a bunch of players with injury histories, and the contradiction out of his mouth just swirls. Chris Grier needs punched in the face and kicked in the balls. He needs to be beat up. He's the kid in the playground who just needs his ass kicked. And to me, that means firing. But that's not happening now. And you look at it, and I think collectively, he, Mike McDaniel, and whoever's running PR, their collective assholes are all puckered up tighter than snare drums as we approach the off season and what appears to be kind of a season going nowhere in 2025. And I guess at this point, it's sort of my gut feeling to kind of take stock of things and try and run a State of the Union through maybe the lens of what Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel would or will try and do as we approach 2025. And I say this with the caveat that, again, I wholeheartedly disagree with Stephen Ross's decision to keep them both. I think it's stupid. I think you're just prolonging the inevitable. This feels a hell of a lot like when Joe Philbin got that ridiculous extension at the end of 2014 when Terrence Fede blocked the punt against the Vikings to entice Ross to give Joe Philbin 2015, and that lasted all of 4 games. It feels like we're there, and that's not a good place to be because you're being stable in mediocrity. Be better, be worse, don't be mediocre. Because if you're worse, at least you put yourself in a position where you can tear it down more easily, and the next wave can come in and get a fresh start. If you're better, then you're hitting the goal that Stephen Ross espouses all the time about being best in class and competing for championships and a sustained winning culture, which I hate to admit is a bunch of bullshit because the Dolphins don't have that. Or at least haven't had it since Dan Marino took snaps under center. So that's what we'll try and do here on the remainder of this show. First, we'll do our half-hearted whiskey segment for the week. I've got Lefroy Quarter Cask in the cup tonight because, well, it's a little bit higher proof, and I think after this past 5 days, we could all use a little something higher proof. But I've done the review on this before, so nothing new. Next show, we will have a brand new bottle. I did scoop up a Dalwhinnie 15 in my new side quest to collect one bottle of the 5 classic malts of Scotland. So that'll be our new quest. And for the record, those are 1 per each region. They did a council study back in the 80s. The lowland is Glenkinchie. The Speyside is Cragganmore. The Islands, or the Isle of Skye, is Talisker. The West Highland is Oban. The Highland is Dalwhinnie. And the Isla is Lagavulin. So if you remember the reviews on the show, we've had Lagavulin 16, we've had Talisker 10. We'll now add Dalwhinnie 15 to the list on the next episode. So here's our sip of Lefroy Quarter Cask for tonight. The burn on that is very good and very appropriate for the episode tonight. And, you think about what has to happen for the Dolphins. I want to shout out Kyle Krabs in the Locked on Dolphins podcast that he recorded earlier today on Thursday, because he had a lot of great information about some of the big name players and big contracts you've got to make decisions on. And, you know those guys. Tua Tagovailoa, Tyreek Hill, Teron Armstead, Bradley Chubb, to a lesser extent, Javon Holland and Jaylen Phillips. And you kind of have to roadmap these things out in sort of the order that they're going to go. Let's start with, what probably needs to happen first. And Kyle pointed this out, is you need to get a decision on what you're going to do with Teron Armstead. He's a phenomenal player when he's on the field, and he actually got you more games played this year in 2024 than any season he's had since 2019. But I believe he turns 33, might even be 34, right before the season starts in the fall, if he is to play in 2025. I know for a fact that the last 2 years he's given serious consideration to retiring. And quick sidebar, if he does retire and ever went into coaching, I would absolutely want the Dolphins to be interested in adding him as an offensive line assistant. He is a coach on the field. But if he does decide to retire, and I'll defer you to Kyle's podcast refer you to Kyle's podcast about the benefits there. But there's a way that the Dolphins can structure the money that he is still owed in a way that frees up a little bit of cap space. The other key points he talked about were with Tyreek Hill. If you do decide to move on from him, number one, you need to figure out how to work best with he and Drew Rosenhaus to keep Tyreek quiet so as not to drive down your asking price on whatever return asset you're going to do. But there's a bigger benefit if you are able to trade him before this year's draft. And maybe you take the route of taking a lower asset. Maybe you take a third or, multiple day 3 picks or something to move off of him. You do eat a little bit more dead money. But the main thing that Kyle pointed out is the bonus that he's due this year is not due until August 31st. So if you get him off your roster before the draft, you may be able to get an asset you use this year, as opposed to, say, like the Houston Texans example of getting a future second-round pick for Stephon Diggs, or giving up a future second-round pick to get Stephon Diggs from Buffalo. Maybe you get an asset to use in the immediate term. You free up more money down the road because you don't owe Tyreek that $15 million signing bonus at the end of August before the season starts. And then you do eat a little bit more dead cap now, but you free up, it's a pretty high number. I want to say it's close to 50 or 60 million in 2026 because you're not on the hook for the rest of his contract. So there's some ways to do it. The same thing with Bradley Chubb. You asked me a couple weeks ago, I said, there's no way you can justify keeping him. But Kyle did some interesting math, and you can restructure that deal where you're essentially taking his cap hit down a considerable amount this year to free up space, and you're not taking on any additional money in the future years. You get to spread it out for that same amount, just over fewer terms. So there's benefits to doing a lot of these things, and you have to make these decisions on key players. Tua Tagovailoa is due, his 2026 salary is guaranteed on March 14th. They're not going to start that process and give themselves $83 million in dead cap, although it should be noted that Kyle pointed out, I believe there are, I want to say 6 teams who carried more than $60 million in salary cap and dead cap money this year that are in the playoffs right now. Buffalo was one. Philadelphia was one. Tampa Bay was one. Minnesota, because of the Kirk Cousins thing, was one and went 14-2. Denver, still carrying Russell Wilson's dead cap money, are in the playoffs. So maybe the Dolphins do decide to start moving on some of these big contracts and they eat a bunch of dead money because Let's be honest, Stephen Ross is getting a river of it from the Orange Bowl ongoing right now, the F1 race, the tennis, the international soccer, rolling loud. The dead cap money doesn't really do anything to him. Yeah, it hinders your team now, but it is possible if you get enough other things right to be competitive even though you're carrying that large sum of dead cap money. I think the main difference is the Dolphins have the wrong people in the main seats on the bus driving this thing that are going to make those decisions and make them most likely incorrect. You know, so we've talked about Armstead, we've talked about Hill, we've talked about Chubb. You have decisions to make, you know, Jaylen Phillips, obviously going into a contract year. Do you want to try and get something done, or are you going to learn a lesson from the Tua situation and let him play out his fifth-year option? I would say this, you know, he's a tremendous person off the field and certainly involved in a lot of great things and seems to be doing very well in attacking his rehab, but he's not Myles Garrett, okay? He's a really good player. He's not great. He's not Myles Garrett. He's not TJ Watt. And he's got an injury history folder thicker than both of those guys combined. I think you're best served letting him play out that fifth-year option and, you know, maybe you franchise tag him or, you know, have more options in 2026 when you have more cap space. Jevon Holland is the interesting one because we know that Barry Jackson has talked about that the team has had discussions about an extension, and, you know, that would imply that Chris Grier is at least entertaining that Jevon Holland can come back. I've heard through various sources that Jevon Holland wants to be the top paid safety in the NFL, and I would scoff at that pretty hard considering the season he just had, but this is one of those things, and I think a lot of fans didn't understand it when I kept advocating for keeping Christian Wilkins, is some of the benefit you're getting from Jevon Holland is the unseen benefit. You know, we talked about the F-14 Tomcat on the episode a couple weeks ago where, you know, because of his ability to be in certain spots in coverage, you're not getting the ball thrown his way, you're not getting the ball thrown downfield, but you're not registering a statistic in the stat sheet, kind of the way Christian Wilkins could fight off double teams and let other guys rally to the ball and make tackles. Now, I think what needs a ton of work is Jevon Holland's tackling ability, his run support, and just general awareness. There's some just incredibly heinous reps on tape where he is in coverage, and thank your lucky stars the ball didn't get thrown to his area, because some of them are so bad you'd think he'd be concussed on the field. But you have to make a decision about him. That's one more hole you have to fill, and it's already kind of a half of a hole given how poorly he played in a lot of games this year. And then two is the big one, because you're not going to take on that $83 million in dead cap by cutting him now. That would be a shocking revelation just based on what was implied during the press conference from Grier and from McDaniel. But there are ways to, I forget the specific part of it, but Kyle mentioned if you basically tackle that last and restructure it, you can spread out that money you would owe him, because his 2026 salary is guaranteed if he's on the roster as of March 15th, you know, beware the Ides of March and all that. You can at least spread that out over the remainder of his contract. You're not trying to eat the elephant in 2 years the way you would if you did it now. But I certainly think the Dolphins very heavily implied they know they have to have a better alternate solution next year. Now, this is certainly not the draft class I would want to go quarterback shopping in. 2026 is certainly shaping up to be one I would want to go quarterback shopping in. So there's that on the medium-term horizon. But it at least seems like there's been pressure applied to Grier and McDaniel to sort of put up more institutional guardrails around the roster, certainly the culture. And I think Chris Grier kind of felt the heat, felt the embarrassment of some of those decisions, and the reasoning for the not signing a backup quarterback because you wanted to play the compensatory pick game is absolutely abhorrent. But that just goes to show, again, Chris Grier, not an architect of the overall strategy. I think once you get beyond those 5 players, and you can free up about $30 million in cap space by maneuvering around their contracts. You can generate another $5 million if you cut kind of the low-hanging fruit in Raheem Mostert and Durham Smythe. So it gives you operational money to play with, as Kyle Krabs pointed out. And again, he goes into very great detail about each of these situations and what the options are, how much you can save, and go from there. So I highly recommend you check out the Locked On Dolphins podcast from Thursday, January 9th. And again, shout out to Kyle for laying that out very specifically yet succinctly on that show. Which brings you to the next point. Once you make the big decisions on the big dominoes, it comes to roster building, and I think that's where Chris Grier is sorely lacking, because he's always been what I would term more of an appeaser. It's never his vision, it's whatever coach's vision has been brought in, and he's been here for, since he's been GM, 3 of them: Adam Gase, Brian Flores, and now McDaniel. And it's 3 pretty different segments of offense and defense, for that matter, each of those 3-year tenures. Now you're going into a 4th year with McDaniel, potentially with a 4th different defensive coordinator if Anthony Weaver gets a head coaching job. I know he's interviewed with the Bears and the Saints thus far. So, what are you going to do there? And, for as much as I dislike what Chris Grier has done, and I think it's time for just fresh thought to be brought in, credit where credit's due. I think in a vacuum, if strictly the role of the general manager was to identify this is a good player, if you took 100 college prospects that are gearing up for the draft, if you took 100 NFL players that are going to be free agents, and you said, hey, Chris, watch these 100 guys, I think he can probably make the valuation on whether this guy is a good player or not. Probably 70 or 80 of them he's going to be right on. I think he's good at that. But that doesn't make you a good general manager, and it doesn't make you a good roster builder. And I think that is where the fresh thought is so needed and, in my opinion, desired, that we're not going to get. And you kind of heard the obvious stated. They're going to invest in the offensive line. And I keep seeing people say, well, it's been ignored, and that's not the reality of it. You went out, the big ticket item you signed when McDaniel first got here in free agency was Teron Armstead. That was the best tackle on the market, and he's been arguably a top 3 left tackle in the game the 3 years he's been here. He's just not on the field consistently enough for the dollars he's earned. You signed Connor Williams, you got rid of him, and you signed Aaron Brewer, who was a really good center. You've used a 2nd-round pick on Patrick Paul. You've signed Kendall Lamb as a swing tackle and re-signed him as a swing tackle. But Chris Grier referenced the 2020 draft when they added Austin Jackson, Robert Hunt, and Solomon Kinley in rounds 1, 2, and traded up multiple picks to get Kinley in the 4th. That seems like the type of investment we're going to get. And, I haven't watched much college football from the people I trust. It sounds like the offensive and defensive line classes are pretty loaded this year. So there's at least that benefit to the Dolphins. And at least it'll finally be addressed, and hopefully it'll be addressed in a more, well, how should I put this? Like, when the Dolphins identify problems, they throw a bunch of resources at it. Look at wide receiver coming out of the Flores era when McDaniel first got here. Well, we knew we had Jaylen Waddle. But you brought in Trent Sherfield. You brought in River Craycraft. You traded for Tyreek Hill. You drafted Eric Ezukama all in that offseason. You're still working on it because you brought in Odell Beckham and D. Eskridge this year. And you at least tried to make those solutions work. So I feel like you're going to get that. You're going to get the quantity investment at the offensive line. You just have to hope you find the quality within that quantity. And again, I have trepidation about the people doing the picking and the coaching staff identifying what they need to be successful, both philosophically and just pragmatically. But it sounds like two positions high on the grocery list for the offseason are backup quarterback, offensive line. You probably need to have a pretty serious discussion about pass rusher, depending on what you do end up deciding to do with Bradley Chubb. If you do retain Anthony Weaver, which I hope the Dolphins do, you have to have a conversation like, are you going to try to play more of that Ravens-style defense, which structurally looks a hell of a lot like what Vic Fangio did the year before, and you have the two kind of stand-up edge players? Or, because you didn't have those guys this past season, are you going to play a lot more heavy under and over fronts? If you do that, do you need to bring back Calais Campbell? Do you need to bring back Emmanuel Ogbah? If those guys don't come back, do you need to bring in analogs for those guys? That's a pretty hefty investment because those kind of players, a big closed-side defensive end, those guys don't really exist a whole lot anymore, especially coming in through the draft. So you've got a lot of investments you have to make and decisions you're going to need to make and how you proactively get that. And, oh, by the way, your secondary was a mess. You've kind of cycled through a bunch of different players next to Jordan Brooks at off-ball linebacker. I have a feeling that Tyrell Dodson is who they're going to land on, but I don't think they should be landing on him as the number 2 guy. He's more of a number 3. And I just don't feel like the Dolphins are going to be capable to fill all these holes in one offseason. Even though they do have 10 picks, you can get free agent money. But because you've driven the roster this way, you're not going to have top dollar to go out and sign, say, like a Trey Smith to play right guard if he shakes out of Kansas City. You're probably looking more at like Will Freeze from Indianapolis if he shakes loose. So you're at this point now where you've got to still kind of be the bargain shop team. You're probably still going to have to do quite a few like 1-year deals where you get guys on small contracts that you can cycle in and out. And that's kind of where you're stuck at, because you need that quality at certain spots and you're just not going to be able to afford it. So you're going to have to hope you end up getting a bunch of rookies who can kind of turn the light on the way Chop Robinson did. He really shined once they got back from the bye. I thought Patrick Paul had some nice moments. There's at least something there to kind of work with and mold into a player. But we know Kendall Lamb is retiring. If Teron Armstead retires or the Dolphins move on from him, you can't just go into the season thinking, well, we're going to have Patrick Paul, Austin Jackson, and then Keon Smith coming off of a knee injury. That can't be what you decide to do at tackle. That's too risky, especially the mandate you threw down about Tua, not getting injured. You'd just be contradicting yourself if you built the roster that way. But I think those points are the points that I'm most cautious about with Chris Grier as we move forward. And That's not taking into account really anything with Mike McDaniel. Obviously, there's the culture element. I don't think that type of stuff should have gotten out, but it did. Maybe that's some of the players kind of, sending up the signal flare like, hey, this guy's not the right guy, and it falls on an absentee owner. I don't know. But, the X's and O's things have to be corrected. We're still seeing the same errors. A lot of McDaniel's in-house processes have to change. And you can kind of tell he's a blocker to some of these things because he was asked about play calling. I've seen multiple people say, if McDaniel's coming back, he needs to give up play calling. I'm sorry, you hired him to run his offense. He's going to run his offense. He's not going to let someone run it for him. He's an arrogant little shit at times, but I think that one you kind of knew going in. I said as much last year, and people still were calling for him to give up plays, and you just knew it wasn't going to happen if you were paying attention. And I think even if you have a really great offseason, and I think it's going to take a really great offseason in matters of public opinion in order to buy in some of the fans and kind of quell the mob that's ready to storm the castle here, because fans are out for blood. I don't think I've ever seen anything on Twitter get as many responses as the statement that Stephen Ross put out after the game. The fans are pissed. I think that's a good thing. But even if you have that great off season, you're still saddled right now for the moment with Danny Crossman. You're still going to be saddled with McDaniel calling plays, with the terrible challenges, with him not being aware of Tyreek Hill removing himself from a game, and any of those other hundreds of micro decisions you have to make as head coach because he's got his nose in his play sheet. You've still got that saddled for you. And to me, it feels like kind of no matter what you do with the roster, no matter what improvements you make, no matter how many games Tua Tagovailoa is able to play, and if he stays healthy, it just feels like you're staring smack dab at like 9-8 or 10-7 at best. Because you got some heavier hitters, at least on paper, coming to town. You got to play the AFC North, which is... Excuse me, you don't play the AFC North. We'll go over the schedule another time. I'm thinking of something else, because the Bengals do come to Miami this year. But you're going to have some heavy hitters on your schedule. And there's nothing there that makes me trust the Dolphins to get this right. And it feels like effectively you're just taking a quantity-driven punt on 2025 and trying to get to 2026. I'm sorry if this was rambling. I tried to remain coherent for all of this. The Lefroy has not yet kicked in, as we'll have our finishing sip here out of the glass. But that's where I'm at, Dolph fans. It feels like this season is so far away, and the off season is far away, even though I've already made some plans to stop in Indianapolis during Combine Week this year. It's just one of those situations where I almost feel like I mentally need to take a month off from just investing thought towards the Dolphins. They're my favorite team. They always will be. They're the team I, invest time in more than any of my other favorite teams, whether it's Arsenal, the Dayton Flyers, even the Cincinnati Reds, who I'll admit I'm a fair weather fan of the Reds at this point, but at least they have a good crop of exciting young talent, and they've at least tried to make some moves, which for the Reds is a big deal this offseason. But I think the one thing that the Reds did right, even though they waited about 2 years too long to do it, was to get rid of David Bell. That's a Nepo baby hire. Because his dad, Buddy Bell, played for the Reds, was in the Reds front office. You brought in Terry Francona, one of the most respected managers in all of baseball. I think at the very least, he probably buys you 8 to 10 wins, just correcting the dumb mistakes that the Reds were so prone to do last year. And that is what I long for the Dolphins. I wanted someone to come in who has been in a winning culture, who can instill a sense of discipline, who's got experience being in big games and winning big games. Because these are all the things the Dolphins lack with Mike McDaniel in charge. And for as much as McDaniel talks about, knowing the gravity of the job and acknowledging the responsibilities of it, for the way that the press conference and the player interviews on the exit day came out, that's a pretty damning indictment of Mike McDaniel and not adhering to the gravity and earning the trust and earning the respect of not only the players themselves, obviously, because they, McDaniel said you can fight them till they're blue in the face, and they didn't care. But it's got to piss off the fan base a shit ton, because I know I'm pissed. And does Stephen Ross know that? Was he aware of this before that press conference? What does he say after if he wasn't? So I think the fallout from this is going to be residual, and it's going to last really until either the Dolphins win a playoff game or McDaniel and Grier are fired. And that's not a good place to be in. And just once, I told this to a friend of mine, just once, I want to go to a bar and sit down, order a beer, have some wings, wearing some Dolphins gear, and at least have someone come up and say, like, damn, I'm really afraid to play the Dolphins this year. And it feels like we're so far from that happening. And I really do want chicken wings at the moment. They just sound good. I realize we're a long way from that happening. And I think that's what makes me so disappointed in this season, is for all the crap, they still found a way to scratch out 8 wins. And I think if you at least build the offensive line and address some of your holes, and you can keep Tua healthy, you're probably going to get another win or 2, maybe 3 even, if one of those other teams falls apart on your schedule. Because someone always inevitably does. But is that as high as this is ever going to go? And I guess kind of the closing thought I had, and this is something I talked about privately with Travis Wingfield and a few others, was what is the height of this build? Chris Grier, using his turn as general manager, got full-scale responsibility unto himself in 2019. Orchestrated the tank and gave Flores the extra year on his contract because they knew they were going to do it. And you got rid of the high-priced contracts, Tannehill, Robert Quinn, Cam Wake. You traded Rashad Jones. You traded Laramie Tunsil. You did it all. For what? What do you have to show for it? What was the high point of that teardown and rebuild? And I think the answer I land on is the high point of it is the week after the Dolphins beat Dallas in 2023. Because you went into that Baltimore game. If you won that Baltimore game, you were going to have possession of the number 1 seed going into week 18. That was the highest point of it. It was within your grasp. All you had to do was beat 2 good teams. And you got stomped by the Ravens, and your special teams cost you against the Bills. And it's been a free fall from there. It's pretty stunning to me that Chris Grier gets another shot at this. And I just don't see the wave of this rising higher than it was going into week 17 of 2023. And that's a bad place to be. And that's kind of my closing thought on this episode. Dolphins fans, I hope you took something out of this. I hope you go listen to it. I encourage you to go listen to Kyle Krabs' episode about the salary cap situation and the possible solutions you have with a number of big-name players on the roster. I hope you listen to all the podcasts on DolphinsTalk.com. Check out the articles. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on Spotify, iTunes, wherever else you listen to your podcasts. We'll have another episode. I haven't quite figured out what my schedule is going to be like as we go into the off season. We'll probably do one for any kind of major news breaking event. I'll have one for, the draft, the combine, that sort of thing. And we'll figure it out from there. But I think I had hinted to this at one point, but had considered making this my last season of podcasting for the Dolphins. But I'll confirm now that we will go on. 2025 will have a Dolphins Talk Weekly podcast. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you for all the interactions on Twitter. Love to hear your questions. Love to hear your feedback. If there's any suggestions you have for the show, I'm willing to listen, and I'm an open book. So thank you guys. I know 2024 didn't end the way we wanted it to. I know the off season feels like it's far away, even though it's really about 2 months from kicking off in earnest. And the final thought I have is at least the Dolphins cannot lose on my birthday next week, because it's in the middle of the week and there are no games. So thank you guys for listening. If you're in the Midwest, stay safe, stay warm, get out of the snow, and we'll see you on the next episode. This episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly was brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com. Caneswear.com.